So welcome everyone to AI in the Newsroom, Promise, Peril, and Responsibility. I don't think I need to tell any of you that artificial intelligence is moving quickly within journalism, from research to reporting and editing, production, and audience engagement. Today we'll explore what's exciting, what's challenging, and what responsibility looks like as newsrooms adapt to these tools. We've brought together a fantastic panel with perspectives across reporting, leadership, research, and product. And so I'm going to introduce going down the line. First, we have Lauren Berry, who is Chief Operating Officer of News Product Technology and Publishing at Bloomberg. She is also an alum of the Hussman School of Journalism and Media. We have Jay Barchas-Lichtenstein, the Senior Research Manager at the Center for News Technology and Innovation. They focus on a broad range of issues, including AI, press freedom, and journalist safety. Marisa Porto is the Knight Chair of Local News and Sustainability here at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media. She's also a former editor and newsroom leader with experience guiding news organizations through digital transformation and organizational change. Tyler Dukes is the lead editor for AI innovation in journalism at McClatchy Media, where he leads a small team to help guide the company's 30+ local newsrooms in using data and automation to elevate and strengthen reporting. And finally, we have Andrew Duck, who is an AI staff writer for Nieman Lab, which is focused on the intersection of generative AI and journalism. So please give them a warm welcome. So to start, I want to get us grounded in the present. AI is something of a buzzword everywhere, but what does it actually look like in practice in newsrooms? And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk about where they're seeing AI making a mark. And so I want to start with Andrew and Tyler. Where are you seeing AI show up in reporting and newsroom practices right now?
Yeah, I'd probably, I'll say it good. Okay, I can probably put it into two buckets. One would be how generative AI products are being integrated into the editorial workflow. So the reporting, the editing, the production of news stories. Some examples of that on the reporting side would be AI transcription tools being used to sit in on local government meetings when beat reporters are not able to attend them themselves, things like school board meetings, town halls. I've seen this rolled out in especially kind of under-resourced local newsrooms. On the editing side, just last month, we had Business Insider announce that they were allowing reporters to actually create first drafts of stories with ChatGPT. I think it's something that a few years ago, we would not have seen, would not have publications, if they were doing it, acknowledge it openly. But that's being normalized in certain parts of the news industry. And as well, I think we're also seeing things like LLM-based fact-checking be integrated into newsrooms. I think that's an interesting development recently. And then the other bucket that I would point to is news organizations actually creating generative AI products themselves for readers. I would call these maybe audience-facing generative AI tools. Things like chatbots are probably the most common, probably the ones that you've come across yourselves. Things like the Washington Post's climate reporting-focused chatbot that was released last year is one example. Election-focused chatbots. I'd shout out actually Sislam's report a couple months ago that was looking at local newsrooms that are building some of these chatbots efficiently and cost-effectively. So we're seeing generative AI both in the creation of journalism, the production of journalism, and generative AI in the ways that audiences are interacting with that journalism.
Yeah, hey everybody. I think that's a good way to differentiate those two buckets. I think the other thing I'd say is that I know we're talking about AI here, and what a lot of us are really talking about when we say AI is generative AI. But I would say that more broadly under the umbrella of AI, this renewed interest in the generative AI sort of column of artificial intelligence has actually, I think, spurred some investment of time and energy and resources into other types of more traditional artificial intelligence that has been in use for a while, using different types of technology. And that's classic sort of machine learning or even automation. And so I think even though these are tools and techniques that have existed for a long time and have been used by a lot of newsrooms for a long time, I think one of the things we're seeing is that generative AI is enabling faster development and adoption of some of those older tools in some cases. And then also because news organizations and the leadership of news organizations are interested in saying, like, here is what we're doing with AI. That often means we can say, sure, we'll do some things with generative AI, but we're also going to do more stuff with automation. We're also going to do more stuff with machine learning, and sort of double down on those tools because there's more attention and focus on them now because they're a lot more part of the conversation. So I think where newsrooms have been really successful has actually been most in those reporting tools, have been the tools where journalists are using to enhance their work or elevate their work or enable them to do reporting that without this technology, it would not be possible. And I think you mentioned transcription, but I know I was talking to another couple of students the other day, and we were talking a little bit about transcription. It was not 5 or 10 years ago that transcription was an extremely hard problem. And if anybody had ever used or heard of a piece of software called Dragon Dictate, which was like an impossible to use piece of software that was super expensive, it was pretty much the only way you could get accurate transcription up until several years ago when we had the advent of technologies like Otter and other competitors. Now we have large language models that are really good at this as well. So, even in the last 5 or 10 years, this really basic fundamental problem that every journalist had and drove all of us crazy, now it's just commonplace. And I think, even though we like to talk about very shiny, cool tools with generative AI, don't sleep on transcription. And that's one of the things I try to remind people is that's a big deal.
So Tyler and Andrew just told us about ways that AI is being used in reporting, and other newsroom operations. But I'm curious, Marisa, about how leadership is thinking about AI. What's driving the interest? Is it cost savings, efficiency, competitiveness, innovation?
I think when we first started talking about after the advent of ChatGPT, when it became more common to talk about these programs, the focus was really about cost cutting. It was about efficiencies. It was about how does this operation use this tool in a way that we can, essentially eliminate positions or eliminate jobs. And today, the conversations I'm having with news leaders are really all about how do we use this product for creativity, for strategy? How do we use it throughout the organization in a way that helps us focus and do our jobs better? And those are the kinds of conversations I think that you're going to see more and more of as leaders, not just news leaders, but leaders in media organizations everywhere start thinking about this less about money, how to make the bottom line better, and more about how to make the product more engaging and develop more audience, and from there become a more holistic use of AI tools throughout the organization.
And I'm curious about product, Lauren. How does product strategy shape newsroom adoption of AI? What are some opportunities or roadblocks that you see?
So I think there's a few different ways we think about it at Bloomberg. There is creating AI-driven news products, which would be things like AI summaries or AI search of news. But then there's also strategic alignment with the newsroom and our content creators around how AI can be used in their workflows. I thought something that Tyler said that's really important is that when we look at some of these, what we call now would be older technologies like automation, which is crazy that that's now old technology, but it is. There's also a maintenance and a scale issue we have with that kind of work. And so I think people vastly underestimate the amount of manual effort there is needed to maintain and check and grow automation systems. And I think that AI allows us to do that at scale significantly better. That frees up manual effort that used to be done by editors in the newsroom to be much more strategic. How can we change the way these automation systems work to be more productive? How can we think around how we use them in a more creative way, as Marisa said? And then I think for our standpoint, we also need to be really aware of our user base and who we're serving. And so within the Bloomberg infrastructure, we have like a very savvy AI user base. They are people who are using AI in their jobs to do their jobs every day. And so I think there's also kind of, as Marisa said, an expectation that news providers are going to keep up with that. And so I think that that can be tricky. As Tyler said, that we kind of feel like we need to have AI because there's an expectation we'll have AI. But I think that where it needs to be really strategic and thoughtful is, where do we use it? Why are we using it? How are we using it? And how are we using this to actually drive impactful product and create better content, and not just for the sake of using it?
And Jay, I wanted to know how this moment fits into larger media, tech, and policy trends that you study. We've heard, some about the practical uses. I'm curious how it fits more broadly.
Sure. As Tyler said, what we now think of as AI, generative AI, is and isn't new. In a lot of ways, the most revolutionary thing about ChatGPT wasn't the GPT part, it was the chat part, in the sense that it made these technologies available to people who didn't necessarily have the technical skills that you used to need to actually run these models and get reasonable outputs out of them. So that's one thing, is that it's less a radical break in the technology itself and more a break in terms of who could use it and how. But one of the largest trends that we're really seeing is gaps between how journalists think about these issues and gaps between how the public thinks about these issues and technologies. And I think that's really important to be aware of. So the public really, by and large, is not aware of the non-generative uses of AI in journalism. They're not necessarily aware about things like, large scale pattern recognition. So helping you figure out, needle in a haystack, what's actually interesting and worth spending my limited human time and ability to report on to go check out. They're just not as aware. And then that also bleeds into a lot of the conversation around transparency, because a huge piece of the puzzle is, how do we talk about what we're doing? And a thing that folks who are very well aware of journalism tend to forget is that the public really knows very little about how journalism is done. So if you say we used AI, period, they think, I asked ChatGPT to write an article. They don't understand all of the human work that went into verifying, that went into making phone calls, you name it. And so as journalists, there's a real need, I think, for more transparency about what journalism is, how humans work. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself maybe, but I mentioned this split because we've been seeing decreasing trust in media pretty much in every country over the last long while. And that gap in awareness of what journalists actually do and how they do it, I think, is a really critical part of that gap.
Thanks. That is actually a great segue into talking about, we've kind of mapped this landscape, but talking more about how the work itself is being transformed. And so I have a couple of questions to ask the whole panel about the ways that reporting, editing, product development, audience engagement, leadership, all of it is being reshaped. And we really also need to think about where humans need to stay at the center. And so I'm going to pose this to everyone. How is AI shifting newsroom roles from reporting to editing to product and then audience engagement?
Anyone can go. I mean, one thing we're seeing is the creation of entirely new roles, which are, sorry, you should really be speaking to this, but strategy directors, professionals who are leading newsroom transformation around these technologies. We've seen it at the largest news organizations in the country, like the New York Times, that has created a multi-person team that is continuing to expand. They just posted a few new jobs. but we're also seeing it at the local newsroom level as well. And so similar to how we saw the emergence of social media professionals and audience professionals 15 years ago, digital transformation leaders 20 plus years ago, we're seeing kind of a whole new category of journalistic work enter the profession. I think that's one, fascinating way that things are changing.
Yeah, as a person with AI and his title, like you, this is a new role, and my team is brand new. And more than a year ago, I was an investigative reporter with sort of a glancing knowledge of what generative AI was, despite having used a lot of sort of traditional machine learning techniques in my work in the past. And so I think that's definitely one big thing. Which does, I think, make this technology somewhat unique. I think social media is a really good example of how there's some professionalization within that sort of area, specifically because it was about sort of managing these new platforms, right? And I think with a lot of this technology, you can view it as a platform, as a brand new platform, specifically generative AI, but you could also just view it as a technology. And so, we didn't create necessarily whole teams around data journalism for a very long time, for example. It took us a long time to sort of establish that, especially in local newsrooms. So I think we're seeing faster adoption of this technology within our newsrooms than previous technologies, which I think is probably also reflective of the broader sort of work landscape. But I think really where we've tried to focus in McClatchy is that we don't want to silo experimentation into any one group. Like, yes, we have created a team that is sort of we could play a consulting role, that we can provide expertise. We could also do some building of more advanced things, but we also want to make sure we're empowering our journalists on the local level, regardless of their beat, or how big their newsroom is, to, try to think critically about how these tools can and cannot work for their work. And I think the only way you do that is not by doing all the work in a 3-person team, 4-person team, but in democratizing it, and making sure everybody sort of has a good understanding and a common vocabulary about how this technology works and how it could be used. And I think that's where you get the real innovation, because I think what's exciting to me is we start learning. Sometimes I'll be talking to my colleagues and I'll learn about a use case that I had not thought of. And that was because that person is applying it to their beat, their community, and they're doing it with their sort of journalistic values at the core.
I think what's interesting about this idea of having more of these roles is that at Bloomberg, I think because we've been doing automation for so long, we've had those roles for a lot longer. I used to have a role that was very similar to that, where I was leading a global team that was focused on ways we could improve newsroom workflows and help people with their jobs. And it was mostly using automation platforms at that time. And I think that what really worked well about the team I had working with that group was that it was the people who had helped build this technology, and it had really revolutionized their jobs already. And so the experience they had already gone through made it easier for them to then do the change management role, which a lot of it is a change management role, that needed to be done in the larger Bloomberg newsroom, where they could actually speak from experience of I used to cover earnings this one way, now I do it this other way. And some of that was really hard, and some of that was actually really exciting. But having people involved in these kinds of roles who've kind of been through the change themselves and have been part of the process of building this new effort, I think has been a really good way that we've done it in my experience. The other thing I would say in terms of how newsrooms are changing, and I know we spoke about this earlier in Marisa's class, but the roles in which journalists will have will change in response to the roles in which generative AI can replace. And I'm really cautious about using that word replace. I don't want to give the implication that it's actually replacing roles, but it is replacing tasks within the workflow. And so if you viewed your job as a copy editor, who your job to be more of ensuring the accuracy of spelling, or making sure that we match style guides, or that the grammar is correct, it may be that in the future, your job is going to be validating AI created content. And that is a different job than working to shape content created by reporters or editors. And so I think people need to be really cognizant around like what skills people need to have to be able to do that well, what familiarity they need to have to do that well, and how the roles and hiring process has changed. I think a really good business example from Bloomberg would be we're using AI in other parts of the business as well. And I think that we need to be thinking around how does the AI use cases we've seen there change the way in which we hire for those workforces as well. And so if we were to think about something like app specs as a place that we hire usually entry-level people to come in and answer client questions, and if we think that in the future chatbots can do some of that work, maybe you're hiring those entry-level people to not just answer questions, but also be the future sales force because they already know how to work with clients. Or maybe you're hiring those people to be part of the teams that develop those chatbots in the future. There's lots of different ways in which those roles can be looked at, and I think we need to be thoughtful around how that changes who we want to bring into our businesses or our newsrooms or our product environments.
And I will just add to that, to Lauren's point, which is this technology will evolve, and as it evolves, the jobs will evolve and the tasks will evolve. And so we can't just say it's going to create a job today and that job will be here forever. We have to understand that as we're going through this process of bringing this technology in some way to our organizations, we are going to have to be flexible, and we're going to have to create opportunities for employees and colleagues to learn these new skills as the technology changes. Because if we don't, we're leaving people behind, and I think that's a challenge for news organizations to think about.
If I can add, I have one data point that I think really speaks to what you were just talking about. In 2024, CNTI did an international survey of journalists. We heard from more than 430 journalists in more than 60 countries, and 45% said that their newsroom was paying too little attention to how AI would help them do their jobs. And 48% said their newsroom was paying too little attention to how it would harm their ability to do their jobs. Most of the rest said it was the right amount of attention. Almost nobody said their newsroom was paying too much attention, less than 10% in both cases. And I think that speaks to some of the anxiety underlying what Marisa was just talking about. People's jobs change. The computer also changed how people did their jobs, but we still do journalism, and needing to take seriously where those concerns are coming from is really important.
I think one thing that's important in this conversation is, and this wasn't the explicit question, but I've certainly heard the question many times, is from journalists and journalism students, is AI going to take my job? And I think the premise of that question is wrong, because AI in any form is not empowered to make management decisions. So AI is not going to take your job, but a poorly informed manager, a poorly informed strategist inside a company could make decisions that will lead to layoffs or reorganizations. And so I think part of the task that we have ahead of us here is to make sure that we are doing the best we can to demystify the marketing around a lot of this technology, to make it extremely clear what this technology is good and not good at, and empower the people who are decision makers to know these things, because they're not often specialists in all these different veins of technology. I don't think that any of these folks are ignorant or stupid, but I think people can be mistaken to believe the marketing when there are, billboards in San Francisco and the Bay Area by companies saying, stop hiring humans, right? Like that's what we are competing against, because I think there's a dose of reality we need to make sure that we apply to the things that these technologies can and cannot do. And even though these technologies will get better, there are things that these technologies will never be able to do. unless there's a drastic rethinking of how their basic architecture, their guts work. And so I think that's a thing that we have a responsibility to do, is to provide good advice, right, based on our skeptical approach as journalists.
Can I add one more small thing? You know, Tyler, before you were talking about social media as in some ways an instructive example, and there's a lot more research on social media guidelines in newsrooms than AI guidelines in newsrooms, simply because they've been around for longer. And one thing that comes up quite often in the research on social media guidelines is that the most effective and best followed guidelines took into account input from people in a lot of different positions in the newsroom, exactly to your point, because and look, I'm a manager. I say this as a manager. Managers don't always know everything that's happening in the weeds of the work. And so having those people who are in the weeds also weighing in on the policies and the guidelines ends up being really important, because you don't always know what you don't know as a manager.
So I have another question to pose to all of the panelists that's related to that, but what are some specific tasks that really should not be done by AI or automated that should remain with humans or with people? I feel weird when I refer to people as humans for some reason, so I will just say people.
Very robotic.
Yes.
I think that the big thing to consider when you think about large language models is that large language models require language. And that may sound silly to say, but I think it's actually really essential to when you think about how generative AI can and cannot be used. And so, for example, if you ask even ChatGPT, but also other more refined AI generative models, a question where there is not language for it to pull from, it is either literally going to make it up or it's not going to provide an answer. And so I was saying in Marisa's class earlier that I had an example yesterday where a reporter in the newsroom asked me, why can't I ask an AI product to tell me what we're missing in our coverage? Like, shouldn't it be able to see everything we've covered on the shutdown so far and say, oh, you missed this important take? And I said, because there's not a story that has written that said, here's what you missed today on this coverage, or no one else has covered that either. And unless there is something for the models to pull from, it cannot provide a factually based answer, at least. The other one would be places where there is a large numerical analysis needed. It is not as good with numbers as it is with words. Which, to be fair, I actually think is also a very, very huge opportunity for news organizations. If you are producing written explanations of numerical content, you are actually providing great value. And I think there is an opportunity to consider how that can be a revenue driver for newsrooms. So content has value. Content has more value in a world in which it is needed to answer questions in some of these models. But you need to be very thoughtful around what that is and how you position it. And when you're using it to create content yourself, you need to be very familiar of where it's likely to succeed and where it's likely to just make something up.
Yeah, and especially given that these models are trained to be overconfident,
Yes.
it's you can be forgiven to say like, well, that sounds right, but I don't know enough about whatever to dispute it, right? And that's where we sort of get into trouble. I think I'm not gonna. This is gonna sound flip, but I'll answer. I think your question. What tasks can't these things do? Journalism.
Yeah.
Right? Like journalism in its most basic form is witness and share, right? And I think the witness part is very difficult for these models. And so talking to sources, developing sources, trying to get people and communities to trust you, trying to figure out, what is happening, trying to show up in a place and differentiate what people are saying online, what's happening in places where you have to touch grass. I think that sort of physical human presence, like being there on the ground, is a huge differentiator. And this is not something that these systems are designed to do. They're designed to take information that has already been compiled and spit out, detect patterns, and give you a plausible answer, right? And so what I try to encourage when I talk to people about like what to use AI for is to forget about the technology and to focus on the problem that you're trying to solve. And if the problem is, for example, I've got 17 hours of audio that I would prefer not to type, right? Which is a task that I have done before and is not fun and has never been fun. I've never met a journalist that was like, I'd love transcribing audio. If that's a problem, what are we going to do and create to solve that problem? I don't think writing is a problem, right? That's just not a problem I'm looking to solve. My colleagues know how to write. I know how to write. And so if I'm not trying to solve that problem, that's not top of my list. Why would I want to use generative AI to write for me? Now, I might want to use generative AI to classify a data set of 10,000 entries, right, in a way that I couldn't do as efficiently before. Like that's a problem I want to solve, right? So I think that's really key when we're trying to think about these tasks. Is like, what is the stuff that you may not be well suited to do because of that basic humanity? And how can you lean into the problem-solving aspect of this? Because it may be that the thing that solves your problem isn't generative AI, isn't the new OpenAI model. It might be something more traditional. And I think that's a good place to start to figure out like where the flow chart lands you. I think to Lauren's point, I think a lot of the stuff that y'all have this experience in the automation space where you're able to say, well, we've done that for years, but you can still land there at some of these problems, I think.
This is
Also to like what you were saying, like ideally we could be using AI to enable people to do more of that actual journalism. And so if you get back the 10 hours that you would have taken transcribing the audio, then I hope that instead you're doing some really impactful reporting. That's also how we see it. If we can enable people to focus on telling the story, and then if AI enables you to do that in a better way or do it in a more efficient way, then I think that's a win. But we don't see a world in which AI is going to tell those stories for us.
This is a pretty specific emerging trend that I'm seeing, but one that is concerning to me, which is the integration of large language models into the fact-checking process. And where we're seeing this coming from is startups that are basically their pitch is, let's automate news aggregation. So we have so many staff reporters at news organizations that maybe actually don't spend their day talking to sources or producing original journalism, but actually are refashioning original reporting from other news organizations for their own audiences. This, to many news organizations, is a kind of work that is, could easily be automated to a degree, or at least that's the pitch. I'm seeing it mostly in the UK and in Germany. Startups like Noah Wire Services and OpenMind, they're using large language models both to identify stories that could be aggregated, create first drafts of those stories, and then finally use large language models to check the figures and the quotes in those stories against what's already out there on the internet. So effectively spot checking these automated news aggregations. And the reason that's concerning to me is because of the propensity of this technology to hallucinate, to confidently be wrong, is another way to describe that. And we've seen ChatGPT OpenAI last month acknowledge just how much its models and its products like ChatGPT are trained to hallucinate. It's built into these technologies to not acknowledge uncertainty. And I think why there's so much interest in LLMs for fact checking is because there's a vacuum in the labor force right now. We've seen so many newsrooms disinvest in human fact checkers and full-time fact checkers that there's a real appeal here for these technologies. But I think, replacing human fact checking power with technologies that are by design not acknowledging uncertainty is a dangerous kind of erosion of editorial standards.
One other piece too, and this is part of what we do as researchers, our guidelines for AI use are all rooted in ethics rather than tools, partly because if they were rooted in tools, they'd be out of date, before we started using them. Things are changing really quickly. And one that we haven't talked about as much here that's relevant for journalists as well is independence. This is particularly an issue, of course, with third-party tools, but we don't really know how LLMs work. Even the people who design them and build them don't entirely know how they work. They're opaque in a way that's a bit scary because if the bias that's built in is sufficiently subtle, we might not notice it until we've gone quite astray. If you think about if you have a compass that's off by 1 degree, it'll get you around town just fine. But if you try driving to Maine, who knows where you're going to end up? And that's the level of bias that I also worry about quite a bit because it's subtle. And I have examples out my ears from transcription and translation specifically about some of these more subtle forms of bias. And so being really mindful. And again, that's not to say don't use it, but to be mindful and to say, okay, well, I know that it's going to take me longer to check and fix a transcript from this person than that person because of bias, and I'm not going to let that influence my choice of sources even when I'm on a deadline, right? And having to be mindful. So that's something we're thinking a lot about.
Yeah, and I think that this hallucination problem in particular is really important as these models get better at tamping down that hallucination rate. Because first off, large language models in general, I've seen no evidence that any large language model or any system built around large language model is completely capable of being 100% hallucination free. And I sat in a vendor demonstration where they said that, and I'm like, you know what? There's no universe in which we're buying your product because you're selling me snake oil. And that's the red flag that is at the top of this, and you just wasted 30 minutes of my time. But I would say that there are ways to reduce that. But I think one thing to be, to also be concerned about is, as these systems get better, we have a greater propensity to sort of fall asleep at the wheel. I would prefer a system that is 70% right 70% of the time than 99.9 or 99% right, because I'm going to overlook. I'm not going to train myself to be on the lookout for those mistakes. With the 99% model, I'm going to my eyes are going to glaze over, and I'm going to start assuming it's correct, and I'm going to trust it more, right? And so I think distrust is a necessary component here. And I think when we think about how to set these tasks up, I think it's really important that we think about tight feedback loops when we think about keeping humans in the loop, because it is much more difficult to fact check a 1,500 word story that was produced by generative AI than it would be to fact check a single sentence or a headline or a series of SEO terms. And I think where we really run into risks here is this illusion of convenience and illusion of efficiency, where what we're doing is squeezing a balloon, right? We're saying, I'm not going to spend as much time writing this, right? But then I've got to babysit the generative AI output on the back end. And I'm spending just as much time doing that as I would have spent writing, right? So I think we have to be careful about that. I think because there's a real risk there.
So in my class earlier this week, one of the conversations we had was that now companies are hiring journalists and freelance journalists to go back through the AI generated content that they've produced to fix it. Like there's a whole group of people who are out there doing this for a living. So they're not getting paid to be freelancers for the actual content production. They're now freelancers for the actual content editing process and correction process. So to your point, that is actually happening in real life today. And we are at a point where, if you think about in recent months, we had the AI generated Marco Rubio voice that was a national news story about his voice being used to talk to people in at the federal level. We have now countries all over the world who have AI generated anchors. We're at a point where journalists, one of the things that we have to teach them is the critical thinking skills to understand, is this real?
So to close out our panel, I do want to turn a little bit to the future. We are joined by a number of students from our school. And so I'm curious what skills or mindsets you would say that they as future journalists and media professionals need alongside AI.
I'll jump in since I was just speaking. Critical thinking skills, right? You can't just, and to Tyler's point, you can't just trust it and say it's going to be okay. You are the human being who has to critically think about whether this is true or not. And that is your value at the table, right? Your value at the table is no one can be you and have that critical thinking and judgment, and use that judgment to understand whether this is a good piece of content, whatever kind of content it is.
I think I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, which would be, I also think though that you need to leave with a good understanding of where using AI is a really good thing. I think it would be really hard to go into a marketplace where you would be going up against potential candidates for jobs. And if you are the one who doesn't know how to use AI to improve your daily life, your workflow, your efficiency, what you're doing well, what you're doing not well, I think that's a really hard place to be. I see this even in the workforce now, where there are people who are using AI really well, really efficiently, and there are people who are not. I think a really good example would be if I'm a COO, I work in a very strategic role. I do a lot of presentations. And there are times where I'll get presentations or documents, and I will know immediately whether or not it was too much reliance on ChatGPT or none at all. And there are some things I think that people need to be starting to adapt to, understanding like how for actual like workforce transformation can AI be really, really helpful. And there are ways to learn how to do that. I would be very thoughtful around how you approach it. I think it takes a lot of practice more than anything else. The more you use these kinds of tools in an experimentation way, you test it out, you know what works, you know what doesn't work, the better you are at using them. But I think it would also be really hard to try and compete with other people when you're looking to get a job and not have that skill set. You should run your resume through a really refined ChatGPT model, for example. If I get a resume that's 6 pages long, that's an immediate sign to me that this is too long of a resume, unless you've been working for a very long time. And there's ways for you to be thinking about that. Think about your cover letters. There's ways that this can be done better. When you're putting together a PowerPoint presentation, there's ways for AI products to help you do this. Think about where summarization actually works really well, where things about where it doesn't, and really start thinking about where this could be helpful for you and getting familiar around how to use it well.
With a little bit of a caveat there that you need to know how to do the things you're asking it to do, because you need to know how to evaluate them, right? If you don't have the baseline knowledge of what a good presentation looks like, you can't necessarily tell the difference between something really streamlined and graphic design is my passion style, too many fonts, too many colors, what is happening here? But I'm with you entirely that knowing what it's good for and bad for are kind of increasingly critical skills.
I would say two things. I mean, I think one, is especially if you're going to practice journalism, of course, I think the block and tackling of doing journalism is important to know. But I think, in general, as it relates to sort of AI in this space, I think there's two things that you need, I think, to bring to the table if you're going to be a AI practitioner at any stage. One is you've got to develop your own taste before you start interacting with these tools. And I think there's a great, Ira Glass has a great radio segment in This American Life where he talks about sort of like how he as a reporter developed his own taste, and he goes back and looks at his old tape and talks about how terrible it was and how he sort of worked on that over time. I think, you know, there's a risk that over-reliance on these tools, I think, to both y'all's points, robs us of that, because that's a thing it takes some time to develop that, right? And it takes like struggling and thinking, and like so much of my career, I've like hated writing because it's a painful process. but you're learning something through that process. And I think that's what you can bring to the table. You can bring that taste to the table in addition to the fact checking and the verification, and everything else you need to figure out, like, is this good, right? Because that's a hard question to answer if you've over relied on these tools too much. And I'd say the other thing that you really need is skepticism. And I think, you know, one of the nice things about being in the university space is that you have space here to hone that skepticism and refine it, and to some degree weaponize it, right? Because I think it's a thing that we need to use as journalists in general to hold people accountable. But I think it's also a thing we need to do to, you know, bring to bear when we're using these technologies and evaluating these technologies, whether we're using them or whether the university is using them or the city is using them or the school board is using them or the government is using them or the Department of Government Efficiency is using them, right? We have to be in a position to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of these tools, because this is not a thing where if you don't pay attention to it, it's going to go away, right? Because it's already being used to drive public policy, and that has profound implications about the lives of us as journalists, but also as the readers that you serve. And that means, you know, the contracts they're signing with these companies. That also means the data centers they're building in our backyards, right? And so I think, you know, spend your time here being skeptical, especially, you know, at UNC. It's a great place to do that because there's so many things you can be critical of at this fine university. So what a great place to hone that skepticism. And so I think that's one thing we really need.
You know, I would encourage people to develop a certain level of fluency in these generative AI products, less as a way to, you know, advocate for you to actually, you know, integrate them into your own work, and more as a way to understand how your readers, your audience might be interacting with journalism in the future, might be consuming news information in the future. You know, I think our industry has settled into this idea that the article page is the basic unit of measurement for digital journalism. And with the emergence of certain generative AI products like ChatGPT, but especially generative search products like AI overviews, Perplexity, we're seeing these technologies start to chip away at the article page. These technologies, they refashion, recycle, regurgitate news articles into other forms. And you know, there's still a lot of open questions about long-term how this might change news consumption habits. CNTI is actually doing a lot of great research on that as we speak. But I think it's important as a journalist to imagine new ways that your journalism might be consumed in the future, similar to how 10 years ago, journalists in the social media era had to adapt to the idea of short form video, or how their articles might be circulating off their news website and on social media platforms. You know, I think there's a similar tide kind of rising in relation to generative search products. So really just starting to wrap your head around how might the news that I produce have a life beyond the article page. I think that's something that's really important.
So I think that's something that like we are doing right now at Bloomberg. So we have generative search products, and we have a lot of users who assumed that we will create more of them. But I think that something we're trying to work with our newsroom on right now is, how does what you need to create potentially need to change in a world in which it's going to be used to answer a question in a AI model, or is going to be used in a more of a summarized fashion, or more utilized in AI products that are looking to surface content in different ways. And that content is different, and the way it needs to be written is different. And I think the other piece of it that we are really diving into right now is, how do we start to look at defining how the value of content changes based on this. And so when we were in the past thinking around how often do people click on something, if people are clicking on fewer things because they're getting their content in different ways and it's being provided via an answer in a chatbot or an AI product, how do we measure that? How does that change the way in which we look at ROI of content sets? And I think that that is something that will be of increasing importance as this kind of technology grows and grows.
So we have just a few minutes, about 7. And I wanted to open it up to the audience for questions. Deb.
If a student wants to ask a question, I would prefer that. Is there
Okay.
anyone? Okay,
Anyone else?
seeing none, I
Okay,
just wanted to congratulate all of you on being fearless leaders into your workspaces. And I'm reminded almost of the March session panel that we had, and some of you were here in the same room. Yeah. And so I have a little question. What is a fair expectation of students when they interview for jobs in your places? I had a student, she got denied an internship opportunity because she did not know, for good reason, what was Nano Banana. Nano Banana, that image creating app. And I thought that was an unfair question because, you can do image generation with other things. So as you interview our students for jobs or anything else, what expectations you have about the particular AI tool they know of?
Yeah, that's crazy. It took me a minute to remember what that was actually, because I was like that would. So I wouldn't have gotten the job either. Who cares about the tools, man? It's gonna change in a month. I mean, and keeping on top of this is a full-time job.
Technology or software versus another place.
Right. And so I think a reasonable expectation is to have an awareness of, the risks and potential rewards of this technology. I don't necessarily think everybody needs to be an expert in it. I think because that takes a lot of time and energy, and you can't be an expert in everything, right? I think I wouldn't necessarily want, even in AI engineer, that I'd want to hire, developer I'd want to hire. I wouldn't expect like an encyclopedic knowledge of these models. I mean, there's hundreds of these models out there, right? By dozens of companies. I think there's no way you can have a knowledge of everything, especially since they're being added to constantly. So but I think in general, like I would love for people to be able to sort of articulate, what they've seen when they've used this stuff and how it's maybe helped them and how it's maybe not helped them, to kind of see what that exposure is, I think is a reasonable expectation.
And I think also to have had that exposure. So I had an interview a few months ago, and I asked the person, how do you use how do you use AI in your daily life? And the response I got was, I used ChatGPT to prepare for this interview. And believe it or not, that didn't go over well. But listen, I think the idea of being asked, how do you use AI in your daily life is a fair question. I think you should be ready for that question. And you should think about what that means for you. I don't think you should be making it up. I don't think you should go learn a lot about how to use AI or start using it in your daily life if it doesn't actually fit for you. But the reason I asked that question was, first of all, this was a role that I think would have a lot of interaction with AI. So I wanted them to have some familiarity with it. But also, I think the ways in which people use AI says a lot about who they are. I am a strategic operations officer at a large global company. I use AI in a different way than my husband, who's an architect, does. And I think it says a lot around like where you're looking for efficiency, what you like to do, what you don't want to use AI for. And so I think you should be ready to at least have a conversation around that. As well as I think it's important to have familiarity with the product set that the place you are applying to has. And so I have always been surprised when I talk to candidates who are unfamiliar with Bloomberg's AI product offerings. And I think that you should come prepared to interviews with that knowledge. And so I think that question you were talking about was crazy. I would have also not gotten that job. But I don't think it's crazy to say how to use AI, and you should not say to prepare for this interview.
Or if you do, you should say, I use it to brainstorm questions you were likely to ask me, not to write my answers.
Yeah, exactly. Or I use it for an analytic to help me have an analytical insight to something, but not just to tell me what Bloomberg was as a company. And I think that there just needs to be an awareness around how people are thinking around AI when you're hiring people. And from the business side, you want to bring in people who are at least being thoughtful around technology and how that's going to impact their future.
I also want to give a little reassurance to the students. A good interviewer and honestly a good manager would have responded to, I don't know what that is, with something like, oh, it's a tool that does X. What tools do you use for X? Tell me how you're thinking about them, and realize what they actually wanted to know, which honestly probably was not about the specific tool. So, I mean, we hope.
It's a good reminder that interviews go two ways. Right? That's a great, it'd be like, you know what? I'm good, man. Like, so it's just a good reminder of that.
I feel like it's also always better in an interview to say when you don't know something than to make it up. When I started at Bloomberg as an intern, and I remember my interview very well because I thought I failed it. Because there was a lot of things that I was asked that I didn't know the answer to. And I was very transparent around the fact that I did not know the answer. But I responded with how I would approach learning more about that, or what I would want to do that, or I focus on what other insights I thought I could add to that interview. But I think it's an important piece to think about, particularly in journalism. I would rather hire somebody who is transparent around what they do and do not know than somebody who feels like they should make something up. And that's kind of the same thing when we're talking about AI, right? I would rather AI not give me an answer than make up one. And so think around like how that all comes together and kind of how you position yourself in those kind of processes.
One more question.
I have a question for Lauren, but anyone can answer. Somebody had mentioned a decrease in trust in media. And so how do you think that applies to news products specifically, like AI news summaries, all of that? Have you seen people like adopt and accept these AI news products positively or with hesitation?
I'll just speak quickly from my experience, which would be that because I have a user base that is very AI savvy, very often the products we release are released with no problems. I think transparency is really important for trust. You should be disclosing when AI is used for substantial parts of creation. Bloomberg has been doing that with automation for years. Even when there have been very, very little impact from automation. If there's an automation tool at all in the process, we've always called it by reporter's name and Bloomberg automation. And I think because we've been doing that for so long, it's just intrinsic to our nature now. There's not a lot of debate around, oh, but we can't say AI was used here because it was only used a little bit. We're used to that with the Bloomberg automation background, but we're also very thoughtful. We don't feel the need, for example, to disclose every time AI was used to recommend a website headline, because that's not a substantial part of the reporting process. So I think it's two things, like knowing your user base, knowing what they are willing and most likely to be confident in you doing, and then also being very clear and transparent around use cases and how things are being used in the production process.
We have a similar sort of user facing sort of key takeaways feature that we launched. And I think one of the things we try to be very thoughtful about, in addition to disclosure, is also like we actually do think a lot about usability and, you know, how we want to present this to people. You know, in this case, and we're not doing anything innovative here necessarily, because I know Bloomberg's had this for a while. Rappler has had, you know, key takeaways and summaries, but, you know, we keep that box collapsed, so you have to sort of opt into it. It's, you know, it's something that's AI generated and editor and reporter reviewed. And we are seeing engagement with it. I mean, because we're able to track sort of who goes in and clicks on that and reads it. And, you know, it's a thing that we're continuing to monitor, and we are seeing people expand it and look at it. And there have been experiments in other places that have shown that those types of things increase engagement. And I don't know if that's something that we're not quite at the point we're able to measure that quite yet. We're still getting more data on it. But I mean, I think that some newsrooms have found that to be a valuable thing, that, or at least that audiences have found valuable. But that key is disclosure.
Just want to shout out a report that came out earlier this week from the Writers Institute for the Study of Journalism, looking at audience attitudes towards various uses of AI in journalism, directly relevant to this question.
So we are a little bit over, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you all for coming, and please give a hand to our panelists who are very generous with their time today.